The closing years of the 1930s and the first months of the Second World War brought aviation into a new age of urgency and innovation. The Luftwaffe, still flush with the success of its Blitzkrieg campaigns, was confronted by the reality that its technological edge was not guaranteed to last. Britain's Royal Air Force had shown with the Spitfire and Hurricane that piston engine fighters could match Germany's Bf-109, and radar-directed air defense could blunt the offensive power of bombers. Within the Reich Air Ministry, voices were growing louder that Germany needed to leap ahead technologically if it was to sustain dominance in the skies. This was the environment in which the Messerschmitt Me-163 was conceived, not as an incremental improvement on piston engines, but as a radical leap into the world of rocket propulsion. The seeds of this effort were sown in the 1920s and 1930s by visionary pioneers such as Alexander Lippisch, a German aerodynamicist fascinated by tailless aircraft and delta wing configurations. His work at the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt für Segelflug, German Institute for Glider Research, produced designs that challenged traditional thinking about stability and lift. Lippisch believed that tailless aircraft offered less drag and greater efficiency at high speeds, potentially unlocking performance unattainable by conventional designs. His theories, initially tested with gliders, drew the attention of the Reich's leadership, who sought radical concepts that could bypass the limits of piston-powered fighters. At the same time, rocket propulsion research was advancing under groups like the Verein für Raumschiffahrt, Society for Space Travel, where Werner von Braun and others were experimenting with liquid-fueled rockets. The Luftwaffe, encouraged by officials such as Ernst Udet, began to see military applications for these engines, not only in guided weapons, but in manned aircraft capable of climbing faster than any bomber formation could hope to ascend. In 1939, Lippisch and his tailless designs were transferred to Messerschmitt, where the vision of a rocket-powered interceptor took tangible form. The strategic need was clear. Germany faced the prospect of enemy bombers penetrating deep into its industrial heartland. Traditional fighters required long climbs and were vulnerable during interception. A rocket-powered aircraft could take off, reach extraordinary altitudes in minutes, and slash through bomber formations at speeds conventional fighters could never reach. The idea was not endurance, but speed and power concentrated into a few devastating minutes of combat, an aerial sprint weapon that could disrupt raids with sheer velocity. The early blueprint was designated the DFS-194, a glider modified to carry a rocket motor developed by Helmuth Walter's firm. Walter's HWK engines were compact and powerful, fueled by a volatile combination of T-Stoff, a highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide, and C-Stoff, a hydrazine methanol water mixture. These fuels, though promising enormous thrust, were dangerously unstable and corrosive, presenting a challenge for both engineers and ground crews. Despite these risks, the potential was too great to ignore. In 1940, the DFS-194 achieved powered flight, reaching speeds of over 550 km/h, an astonishing figure for what was essentially a testbed. Encouraged by these results, Messerschmitt received authorization to proceed with a full-scale development project. The Reichs Luftfahrtministerium, RLM, gave the program high priority, seeing it as a possible counter to the Allied advantage in bomber strength. Lippisch's tailless configuration was married with Walter's rocket motor, and the result was the prototype of the Me-163, the world's first and only operational rocket fighter. It was unlike any other aircraft of its time, small, almost stubby in appearance, with sharply swept wings and no horizontal tail. It looked futuristic, and it promised performance that bordered on science fiction. But the challenges were immense. Stability at transonic speeds was poorly understood, and aerodynamic testing was limited. Fuel handling was hazardous, requiring specialized crews in protective gear. Moreover, the short endurance of the rocket engine, mere minutes of powered flight, meant that the interceptor's mission profile would be radically different from that of conventional fighters. The Me-163 was not conceived as a versatile aircraft, but as a single-purpose weapon: launch, climb, strike, and glide back to base. By 1941, the German leadership had placed its faith in this daring experiment, hoping it would provide the decisive edge against the growing Allied air threat. The Komet, as it came to be known, was poised to push the boundaries of aviation further than any combat aircraft had done before. It represented both the genius of German engineering and the desperation of a regime willing to gamble on extreme solutions. The origins of the Me-163 lay not just in technological ambition, but in the strategic pressure of total war, a crucible in which unconventional ideas could become reality. The transition from theory to practice for the Me-163 was as dangerous as it was groundbreaking. After the encouraging results of the DFS-194, attention shifted to producing a true prototype that could demonstrate the full potential of rocket propulsion in a manned fighter. In 1941, work began on what became the Me-163A, a sleek, compact machine with sharply swept wings and a short fuselage designed to accommodate the Walter HWK RII-203 engine. Unlike conventional fighters, it carried no tailplane, relying on its delta-like wing for both lift and stability, an unconventional approach that carried inherent risks but promised reduced drag and higher speeds. Testing began cautiously with glider trials. Pilots were towed into the sky by BF-110s and then released, gaining valuable data on handling characteristics before powered flights were attempted. Early reports noted that the Me-163A was stable and controllable in the glide, but landing remained a challenge due to its unusual skid-based undercarriage system. Instead of traditional wheels, the aircraft relied on a jettisonable takeoff dolly and a retractable skid for landing. This simplified design reduced drag and weight but introduced difficulties, especially when the aircraft returned to uneven fields or damaged runways. When the Walter rocket motor was finally tested in the prototype, the results astonished even hardened Luftwaffe observers. With thrust engaged, the small fighter leapt forward with ferocity unlike anything pilots had ever experienced. Acceleration was brutal, and the aircraft could reach speeds well above 800 km/h within seconds, climbing to altitudes of over 9,000 meters in little more than 3 minutes. Test pilots described the sensation as unlike any conventional flight, a near vertical climb that defied expectation. The Komet became the first aircraft to exceed 1,000 km/h in level flight, an achievement that stunned the aviation world. However, these flights also exposed new and dangerous problems. Rocket propulsion was still in its infancy, and stability at high speeds was poorly understood. Compressibility effects near the speed of sound caused sudden and violent changes in control responsiveness. Pilots reported heavy buffeting, control lock, and unexpected nose pitches, symptoms of entering the transonic region that no one at the time could fully explain. Furthermore, the corrosive and highly volatile fuels of the Walter engine posed constant threats. Any leak or mishandling during fueling could lead to catastrophic explosions or the dissolution of protective suits. Several accidents occurred during the testing phase, killing ground crew and pilots alike. The promise of revolutionary performance came at a terrible cost. Despite these hazards, the Luftwaffe pressed forward. By 1942, the Me-163B was under development, incorporating lessons learned from the A-series prototypes. The B model featured a refined airframe, a more powerful HWK 109-509 rocket engine, and improved cockpit layout. It was still a radical design, but its performance figures continued to impress on paper, speeds exceeding 950 km/h, climb rates unparalleled by piston engine fighters, and the ability to strike bomber formations before escorts could react. Yet endurance remained a crippling limitation. With only about 7.5 minutes of powered flight available, the Me-163 had to rely on its glide capability for both interception and return to base. Testing also revealed operational challenges. The takeoff dolly system frequently caused accidents if it failed to detach properly, leading to crashes or damaged aircraft. Landings on the skid were often violent, leaving the pilot vulnerable if the aircraft flipped or slid uncontrollably. The short endurance meant that pilots had only moments to position themselves for an attack run, demanding precision and nerves of steel. Training accidents were common, and the pool of qualified pilots remained limited due to the aircraft's unforgiving nature. Nevertheless, the German leadership saw no alternative. With Allied bombing intensifying and conventional fighters unable to stem the tide alone, the Me-163 represented a chance, however slim, to regain control of the skies. By late 1943, operational testing units were being formed, preparing the radical rocket fighter for combat service. The Luftwaffe would soon discover whether the speed and power of the Komet could compensate for its fragility and danger, or whether it was destined to remain a technological marvel with limited practical value. When the Me-163 entered limited service, it did so under the shadow of urgency. By 1944, the Allied bombing campaign against the Reich was reaching devastating intensity. Daylight raids by the USAAF's B-17 and B-24 formations, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustangs, inflicted losses on German industry and infrastructure at an unsustainable rate. The Luftwaffe's conventional fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, were increasingly outnumbered and outperformed at altitude. In this desperate context, the Komet was rushed into frontline deployment despite the dangers already apparent during testing. The first operational unit was Erprobungskommando 16, established in late 1943 to prepare pilots for combat with the Me-163. Training emphasized the unique handling characteristics of the rocket interceptor: the steep climbs, the extremely short-powered flight, and the transition to gliding attack profiles once fuel was exhausted. Pilots accustomed to piston-engine aircraft found the acceleration shocking, and many struggled with the abrupt shift from immense thrust to silent glide. Moreover, every sortie carried the risk of catastrophic accident, not only in flight but even before takeoff during fueling operations. Crews handling T-STOF and C-STOF worked in heavy protective suits, fully aware that a single spill could eat through flesh and metal alike. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe introduced the Me-163B into Jagdgeschwader 400, JG-400, a specialized rocket fighter wing. Operating from Brandis and other airfields near Leipzig, JG-400 represented the world's first rocket-powered combat formation. The unit's mission was simple in theory but daunting in practice: intercept Allied bombers, climb through their escort screen, and destroy as many as possible in a lightning-fast pass. Once fuel was spent, the Komet would glide back to base, vulnerable to pursuit but ideally beyond the reach of enemy fighters. The Komet's first combat actions demonstrated both its extraordinary potential and its profound limitations. In August 1944, Me-163s of JG-400 made contact with American bombers over central Germany. The rocket fighters tore through bomber formations at speeds exceeding 900 km/h, so fast that defensive gunners had little chance to track them. Reports suggest that several B-17s and B-24s were damaged or destroyed in these early encounters, the sheer velocity of the attack leaving crews shocked and disoriented. For the first time, Allied airmen faced an interceptor that moved faster than anything they had imagined possible. Yet these successes were fleeting. The attack window was measured in seconds, often giving the pilot time for only 1 or 2 firing passes before fuel ran out. The Me-163 carried a pair of 30 mm Mk-108 cannons, weapons capable of devastating a heavy bomber with a few hits. However, the incredible closing speeds made accurate firing difficult, and many passes ended with wasted ammunition. The Luftwaffe experimented with alternative armaments, including upward-firing mortars designed to detonate beneath bomber formations. But such innovations were never fully standardized before the war's end. Equally problematic was the aircraft's vulnerability during landing. Once gliding back without power, the Komet became easy prey for prowling Allied fighters. P-51s often loitered near known Komet bases, waiting for the rocket fighters to return. Several Me-163s were destroyed on approach or while sitting helpless on their skids after landing, unable to move until ground crews arrived with towing vehicles. Losses mounted quickly, not just from enemy action but also from the aircraft's own dangerous quirks. Hard landings frequently shattered fuselages, and fuel accidents claimed more lives than combat itself. Still, for a brief moment, the Komet brought hope to a Luftwaffe under siege. Pilots who survived their first missions marveled at the aircraft's raw speed and climb rate, unmatched by any Allied fighter. The psychological effect on bomber crews was undeniable, even if the actual tally of aircraft destroyed remained relatively low. For the Reich's leadership, desperate for any technological miracle, the Me-163 appeared to offer at least a symbolic counterstroke against overwhelming Allied air power. In reality, the aircraft's operational record soon revealed the truth. The Komet was too fast, too dangerous, and too limited to change the course of the air war. Its combat debut showed glimpses of what rocket propulsion could achieve, but also underscored the impracticality of such a weapon in sustained operations. The stage was set for the Luftwaffe's further attempts to refine tactics and extract some measure of effectiveness from this volatile machine, even as the war situation deteriorated around them. As the Luftwaffe tried to adapt the Me-163 into an effective weapon, it quickly became clear that combat operations presented challenges no test program could fully anticipate. The aircraft's speed, once its greatest asset, also proved to be its most formidable obstacle. Approaching a bomber stream at nearly 900 km/h gave pilots only a few seconds to identify targets, align their sights, and fire before they overshot. Traditional gunnery techniques developed for piston engine fighters were almost useless at these velocities. Many sorties ended without a single confirmed kill, not because the Komet lacked firepower, but because the human element could not keep pace with the aircraft's performance. To address this problem, engineers and tacticians sought alternative solutions. One experimental system, known as the Jagdfaust, mounted vertical 50mm recoilless mortars that would automatically fire when the aircraft passed beneath a bomber. In theory, the weapons would unleash a devastating barrage into the vulnerable belly of a B-17 or B-24 without requiring precise aiming. Though tested in limited numbers, the Jagdfaust achieved at least one recorded success against a B-17 in 1945. However, by the time it appeared, the war was already lost, and such innovations arrived too late to make a difference. Tactical employment of the Komet also faced structural limitations. With barely 7 minutes of powered flight, pilots had to climb steeply into the bomber formations, attack once or twice, and then disengage into a powerless glide. Escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang, initially unable to match the rocket interceptor during its climb, quickly learned to exploit its vulnerabilities. They would circle near Komet bases, waiting for the aircraft to run out of fuel and return to land. In this unpowered state, the Me-163 was defenseless, gliding slowly toward a predetermined strip. Several were destroyed in this vulnerable phase, sometimes before ground crews could reach them to tow them away. Landing accidents became a grimly familiar part of Komet operations. The jettisonable takeoff dolly occasionally failed to detach, causing the aircraft to bounce uncontrollably. The skid landing system, while light and simple, was prone to collapse or sudden deceleration that injured pilots and damaged airframes. A single rough touchdown could render the aircraft unusable, and many Komets were written off without ever encountering an enemy. For the men of JG-400, the risk of fiery death on the runway often outweighed the chances of success in the sky. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe attempted to refine tactics. Pilots were instructed to climb well ahead of incoming bomber streams, then dive at shallow angles to prolong their firing opportunities. In practice, the chaos of air combat rarely allowed such textbook maneuvers. Allied escort fighters grew increasingly adept at countering the Komets, and bomber formations adapted their defensive fire to anticipate lightning-fast attacks. The psychological shock of the first encounters gave way to a more calculated response, and the Allies learned that the Komet, while dangerous, was not an unstoppable superweapon. Combat records reflect this mismatch between expectation and reality. Estimates suggest that Me-163 pilots scored between 9 and 16 confirmed aerial victories throughout the war, at the cost of far greater losses to accidents, crashes, and combat attrition. For a project that consumed immense resources and endangered the lives of its own personnel, this was a deeply disappointing outcome. Even when a Komet succeeded in shooting down a bomber, the tactical impact was negligible compared to the thousands of Allied aircraft striking Germany daily. The Luftwaffe's faith in radical weapons like the Me-163 revealed the desperation of a nation under siege. Where once the rocket fighter was heralded as a glimpse of the future, its actual combat performance exposed the limitations of technology divorced from operational practicality. The Komet was too fast to control effectively, too fragile to survive prolonged deployment, and too specialized to alter the balance of air power. Still, it remained a haunting presence in the skies over Germany, a machine that embodied both the brilliance and the futility of late-war German aviation. Its adaptation to combat marked both the peak of its achievements and the confirmation of its shortcomings, leaving its legacy as a technological marvel rather than a decisive weapon of war. The limitations of the Me-163 in combat pushed German engineers to search for refinements that might increase its effectiveness, or at least make it safer to operate. The B series, which entered service, was only the beginning of a design lineage that aimed to overcome some of the most glaring flaws. Yet in the compressed time frame of 1944-1945, few of these improvements advanced beyond prototype or paper stage, and those that did were often undermined by Germany's collapsing war industry. The Me-163B itself incorporated refinements learned from the experimental A series. It carried the more reliable HWK-109-509A engine, a pressurized cockpit, and improved armament in the form of twin 30mm Mk108 cannons. But issues with fuel consumption and dangerous handling persisted. Engineers considered extending endurance by enlarging fuel tanks, but this would have required redesigning the airframe, further complicating an already risky project. A proposed Me-163C sought to resolve these problems more thoroughly. It featured a stretched fuselage to hold additional fuel, a more powerful HWK-109-509C engine with separate combustion chambers for cruising and combat power, and improved aerodynamics for higher speeds. The C model promised endurance nearly doubled from 7 to 12 minutes of powered flight, potentially allowing more effective interception missions. Only prototypes were built, and none saw combat. Even more ambitious was the Me-263, initially designated Ju-248, intended as the true successor to the Komet. This design incorporated retractable tricycle landing gear, solving the dangerous skid landing problem, and provided greater fuel capacity and endurance. The Me-263 aimed to eliminate many of the operational hazards of its predecessor, offering a rocket interceptor that could launch, fight, and recover with less risk. By late 1944, prototypes were under construction, and one airframe reportedly achieved limited test flights in early 1945. But Allied bombing raids and the deteriorating state of German aviation prevented further progress. The Me-263 never entered mass production, ending as another of the Reich's unrealized wonder weapons. Parallel to these official projects, experimental modifications were tested in limited numbers. Some Komets carried the upward-firing Jagdfaust mortars, a novel system intended to bypass the problem of firing accuracy at extreme speeds. Others experimented with camera equipment for high-speed reconnaissance roles, though the short endurance made such missions impractical. Trainer versions, designated Me-163S, were produced without rocket engines to allow safer pilot familiarization through glider flights. Even these, however, carried risk, as the handling characteristics remained unforgiving. The broader technological influence of the Komet extended beyond its variants. Its rocket propulsion system offered invaluable data for future aerospace development. Engineers gained insights into the handling of liquid propellants, the structural stresses of transonic flight, and the dangers of compressibility effects near the sound barrier. While the Me-163 itself was a poor operational weapon, it was a pioneering step toward the jet and rocket research that would define post-war aviation. Foreign interest in the design also emerged as the war drew to a close. Japan, an ally of Germany, sought to acquire advanced weapons technology, including the Komet. Technical documents and at least one disassembled aircraft were transferred by submarine in 1944, though many shipments were lost en route. From this transfer, Japanese engineers developed the Mitsubishi J8M, essentially a local copy of the Me-163B. However, Japan faced similar difficulties with rocket fuels, training, and industrial shortages. Test flights of the J8M ended in fatal crashes, and the project never reached operational service before Japan's surrender. In Germany itself, the Komet's evolution remained stunted by circumstances. The aircraft stood at the intersection of visionary engineering and strategic futility, a machine too advanced for the infrastructure that attempted to support it. Its variants and planned successors demonstrated that engineers understood its flaws and were capable of improving them. But the war left no time for maturation. What survived were blueprints, incomplete prototypes, and the knowledge gained through the sacrifice of test pilots and operational crews. Thus, while the Me-163 remained unique as the world's only operational rocket fighter, its story was not one of sustained technological progress within the Third Reich. Rather, it was a flash of innovation constrained by desperation, leading to a series of variants that promised solutions but delivered little in practice. These efforts, though largely unrealized in their own time, laid fragments of groundwork for rocket and space research that would soon find new life under Allied stewardship in the post-war era. The global impact of the Messerschmitt Me-163 extended far beyond its modest combat record. Though it failed to alter the balance of power in the skies over Germany, it stood as a harbinger of the technological revolution that would follow the Second World War. In many respects, the Komet was less a weapon of immediate value than a glimpse into the future of flight, and its legacy was shaped as much by those who studied it after the war as by those who flew it during it. When Germany surrendered in 1945, Allied technical teams scrambled to secure examples of advanced German aircraft. Among the most coveted were the Me-262 jet fighter and the Me-163 rocket interceptor, both representing radical departures from piston-driven aviation. Several intact Komets, along with prototypes and technical documentation, were captured by American, British, and Soviet forces. Each nation recognized the aircraft's significance, not for its battlefield performance, but for the lessons it offered in propulsion, aerodynamics, and high-speed flight. In the United States, captured Me-163s were shipped to Wright Field and other research facilities. Engineers and test pilots examined the rocket engine, the unusual skid landing gear, and the swept-wing design. Though the dangers of the volatile fuel precluded extensive powered testing, the aerodynamic data proved valuable. The Komet's ability to reach altitudes and speeds previously unattainable in manned flight highlighted the possibilities of rocket propulsion, influencing subsequent research in both military interceptors and the emerging field of space exploration. American engineers also noted the physiological challenges faced by Komet pilots: rapid acceleration, extreme altitude changes, and transonic instability, factors that would later shape astronaut training and cockpit design. In Britain, too, the Komet attracted attention. The Royal Aircraft Establishment acquired examples for study, comparing the German rocket fighter's performance and construction with British jet projects. While the British did not pursue rocket interceptors directly, the lessons gleaned from the Me-163 contributed to a broader understanding of high-speed aerodynamics, informing the design of post-war experimental aircraft such as the de Havilland DH-108 Swallow and later supersonic projects. The Soviet Union also exploited what it captured. Several Me-163s were transported to Moscow, where they were reverse-engineered as part of research into advanced interceptors. The result was the Mikoyan-Gurevich I-270, a Soviet rocket fighter closely based on the Komet's design. Although the I-270 remained experimental and never entered service, it demonstrated the enduring fascination with rocket-powered flight. Soviet engineers, like their Western counterparts, recognized both the promise and the peril of such technology. The instability, limited endurance, and fuel hazards remained unsolved, and jet engines quickly emerged as the more practical path forward. Japan's attempt to replicate the Komet in the form of the Mitsubishi J-8M underscored the global influence of the design, even though it ended in tragedy. The failed Japanese trials reflected the same dangers encountered in Germany, proving that the Komet's challenges were universal and not merely the product of rushed German development. Beyond the laboratories and test hangars, the Komet found its place in history as a cultural and technological icon. Surviving examples were preserved in museums across the world, from the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., to the RAF Museum in London and collections in Germany, Russia, and beyond. Visitors who encounter the compact rocket fighter today are often struck by its futuristic appearance, a reminder of how advanced it must have seemed in the 1940s. The Komet's sleek, tailless silhouette anticipates later delta wing and spaceplane designs, bridging the gap between wartime desperation and the dawn of the space age. In retrospect, the Me-163 was never truly a practical combat aircraft. It was a weapon designed in the crucible of crisis, a technological gamble pursued in the hope of offsetting overwhelming Allied superiority. Its impact on the war was negligible, yet its influence on aviation history was profound. It forced engineers and strategists to confront the realities of rocket propulsion, extreme acceleration, and high-altitude flight. It demonstrated the dangers of pushing technology ahead of operational readiness, but also revealed the potential of concepts that would later find fulfillment in jet fighters and spacecraft. Thus, the legacy of the Me-163 lies not in the handful of bombers it destroyed, but in the vision it embodied. Too fast to control, too dangerous to sustain, and too limited to prevail, it nonetheless pointed the way toward a future in which speed and altitude would define aerial combat and exploration alike. The Komet was both a dead end and a beginning, an aircraft remembered not for what it achieved in war, but for what it foretold of the world that followed. While the main arc of the Me-163's story was written in its operational record and its post-war influence, there were chapters that remained obscured in technical files and fragmentary reports. These lesser-known aspects, often overshadowed by its notoriety as a rocket-powered interceptor, add depth to the understanding of what the Komet represented in practice and what it might have become under different circumstances. One of the most important but overlooked roles of the Komet was as a research vehicle. Even before the B-series was introduced into combat units, Luftwaffe test centers used the aircraft to probe the boundaries of high-speed aerodynamics. German engineers working with limited knowledge of compressibility effects gathered critical data about control surfaces, structural stresses, and shockwave formation near the speed of sound. Some of these test flights ended in disaster as pilots encountered abrupt stalls or uncontrollable dives. Yet the data recovered informed not only German aviation but also the Allied research programs that absorbed these findings after the war. In this sense, the Komet served as a bridge between wartime aviation and post-war supersonic exploration. Another little-known application was in pilot training. Because the rocket-powered versions were too hazardous for initial instruction, unpowered trainer variants, designated Me-163s, were developed. These glider-based aircraft allowed new pilots to become familiar with the unique landing characteristics of the skid system. To conserve resources, some were even converted from damaged B-series airframes stripped of their engines. Although safer than the fueled version, accidents still occurred, and the unforgiving handling qualities of the tailless design claimed additional lives. The Me-163s highlighted both the ingenuity and the desperation of Luftwaffe training methods in the final years of the war. There were also experimental weapon systems that never progressed beyond limited trials. In addition to the Jagdfaust upward-firing mortars, engineers envisioned fitting the Komet with larger caliber cannons or even experimental rockets to maximize its fleeting attack window. One radical idea proposed converting the aircraft into a manned missile, a one-way weapon in which the pilot would eject shortly before impact. Though no evidence suggests such a variant was seriously pursued, the concept reflects the atmosphere of desperation in which many late-war German projects were conceived. Some forgotten missions of the Komet reveal its symbolic rather than tactical value. Reports indicate that in late 1944, when Allied bombers were striking central Germany relentlessly, Luftwaffe leaders occasionally scrambled Komets less to intercept than to showcase to local civilian populations that the Reich still possessed miracle weapons. These brief launches, often ending without combat contact, were intended to bolster morale and demonstrate technological defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. For pilots, however, such missions carried all the same risks of accidents and enemy encounters without offering meaningful contributions to the defense effort. There were also plans, largely unrealized, to employ the Me-163 as a high-speed reconnaissance platform. The aircraft's ability to climb rapidly and escape interception seemed ideal for photographic missions. However, its short endurance and dangerous landing procedures made this impractical. A few proposals circulated in Luftwaffe documents, but by the time they could have been implemented, resources were too scarce and priorities too chaotic to divert aircraft from their intended interceptor role. In retrospect, these unseen chapters of the Komet's history illustrate the dual nature of the project. On one hand, it embodied daring innovation, a platform that yielded insights into high-speed flight and novel weapon systems. On the other, it reflected the futile improvisation of a regime struggling against inevitable defeat. The forgotten missions, experimental modifications, and training tragedies all contributed to the Me-163's reputation as both a marvel of engineering and a symbol of the dangers of rushing unproven technology into combat. When the war ended, these lesser-known elements were often left out of the broader narrative, overshadowed by the dramatic image of a rocket-powered fighter streaking through bomber formations. Yet they remind us that behind the headline, achievements lay a more complex reality. A machine that consumed vast resources, cost many lives, and ultimately served more as a laboratory than as a battlefield weapon. The unseen chapters of the Me-163 tell of ambition unmatched by capability, a story that complements its better-known legacy as the world's only operational rocket interceptor. The story of the Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet closes not with triumph, but with the sobering reality of its place in history. Despite its breathtaking speed, radical design, and the aura of a wonder weapon, the aircraft proved a stark example of how advanced technology alone cannot overcome strategic imbalance. Its impact on the course of the Second World War was minimal, yet its lessons resonated far into the future. From a purely operational perspective, the Komet's combat record was negligible. Over its brief deployment, it destroyed only a handful of Allied bombers, perhaps fewer than 20, while losses due to accidents, fuel explosions, and landing mishaps numbered far higher. For every bomber shot down, multiple Komets were destroyed on the ground, lost in crashes, or consumed in fire during fueling. This imbalance was unacceptable in a war where resources were dwindling and trained pilots were irreplaceable. By 1945, Luftwaffe commanders admitted privately that the aircraft had failed as a weapon, even as propaganda continued to extol its futuristic design. Yet it would be wrong to dismiss the Komet as meaningless. The project represented one of the boldest leaps in aviation up to that point, forcing engineers to confront challenges of transonic flight, rocket propulsion, and pilot survivability under extreme conditions. These were the very issues that would define the next era of aerospace research. The Me-163 showed the limits of what could be achieved with brute technological daring without a stable operational framework, and in doing so, it helped guide more practical solutions, jet propulsion chief among them. The aircraft's legacy can also be traced in the careers of those who studied it after the war. Allied engineers, whether in the United States, Britain, or the Soviet Union, gained access to captured Komets and their documentation. The design's swept wings anticipated later supersonic aircraft, and the handling lessons informed experimental programs on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The United States X-series of rocket planes, culminating in the Bell X-1 breaking the sound barrier in 1947, drew indirectly from the aerodynamic frontiers first glimpsed in the Me-163. In the Soviet Union, experiments with the Mikoyan-Gurevich I-270 showed how the concept, though flawed in combat, could serve as a stepping stone in the pursuit of advanced interceptors. For the men who flew it, the Komet left mixed memories. Some pilots recalled the exhilaration of unmatched acceleration and speed, a sensation that no piston engine fighter could approach. Others remembered only the constant danger of burning fuel, collapsing skids, or Allied fighters circling their bases like vultures. To fly the Komet was to gamble one's life against not only the enemy, but the very machine itself. It became infamous within the Luftwaffe as both a technological marvel and a death trap, admired and feared in equal measure. Today, the surviving examples of the Me-163 preserved in museums stand as artifacts of ambition constrained by desperation. Visitors are often struck by its compact size, its futuristic lines, and the thought that such a machine once hurled itself into the skies of war-torn Europe. The Komet inspires fascination because it embodies both the allure of innovation and the consequences of misapplied genius. It was too advanced for its time, too dangerous to its pilots, and too limited to its mission. In the final analysis, the Me-163 Komet is remembered not as a decisive weapon of the Second World War, but as a milestone in the story of human flight. It represented the extreme edge of what wartime Germany could achieve under pressure, and in failing, it illuminated the path for those who followed. Its real legacy lies not in the bombers it destroyed, but in the knowledge it provided, knowledge that helped shape the jet age and the early steps into space. The Komet remains a paradox, a symbol of both futility and progress, a weapon that never fulfilled its purpose, yet changed the trajectory of aviation history forever. The Messerschmitt Me-163's reputation as too fast to control rests not only on its operational failures, but also on the broader lessons it imparted to aviation and military strategy. At the time of its conception, Germany placed great emphasis on so-called Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons that might shift the course of the war through technological surprise. The Komet became one of the clearest examples of this philosophy. An aircraft designed around an extreme performance envelope with little consideration for sustained use, logistics, or pilot survival. In this way, it revealed the flaws of relying on singular innovations rather than comprehensive, balanced development. The practical difficulties of fueling, launching, and recovering the Me-163 exposed the enormous gap between experimental technology and battlefield conditions. The requirement for specialized fuel crews and protective gear slowed operations to a crawl. The reliance on a skid landing meant that every mission ended with an aircraft stranded on the runway, immobile and vulnerable. The violent volatility of T-STOF and C-STOF made each sortie a gamble with chemistry as much as with combat. These were not minor issues of refinement, but structural limitations that no wartime fixes could resolve. From a strategic perspective, the Komet illustrates how desperation can accelerate innovation while simultaneously undermining its usefulness. German engineers achieved what had seemed impossible: a manned, rocket-powered interceptor that could reach bomber altitudes in minutes. But the strategic situation by 1944-1945 required sustainable defenses, not experimental marvels. Allied bombing raids involved hundreds of aircraft supported by deep escort screens. Even if every Komet sortie had destroyed a bomber, the scale of the offensive would not have been blunted. The Luftwaffe needed quantity, durability, and efficiency. The Komet offered the opposite: rarity, fragility, and peril. Nevertheless, the aircraft's symbolic impact was undeniable. Allied intelligence reports noted that bomber crews were shaken the first time they encountered the rocket fighter, describing it as if a red flash streaked past, faster than the eye could track. Propaganda within the Reich hailed the Komet as proof of German ingenuity, showcasing it in newsreels and posters. In reality, its contribution to the war effort was negligible, but its presence carried a psychological weight out of proportion to its numbers. For aviation history, the Me-163 occupies a unique place. It was the first and remains the only operational rocket fighter ever fielded. It demonstrated the dangers of compressibility near the sound barrier, problems later solved in the jet age with swept wings, stronger airframes, and supersonic testing. It provided post-war researchers with insights into rocket propulsion systems, liquid fuel handling, and pilot physiology at extreme speeds and altitudes. These contributions, though indirect, helped shape the transition from propeller to jet, and from jet to spaceplane. The Komet also serves as a cautionary tale. It showed that raw speed cannot alone define a successful fighter, and that weapons rushed into combat without adequate consideration for logistics or strategy risk becoming liabilities rather than assets. For all its innovation, the aircraft destroyed more of its own than it did of the enemy. Its story is thus both a monument to human daring and a reminder of the costs of technological hubris. In the broader legacy of the Second World War, the Me-163 remains a striking symbol of the contradictions of late-war German aviation. On one hand, it pointed toward the future of flight, embodying ideas that would later find fulfillment in supersonic jets and space exploration. On the other, it encapsulated the futility of relying on last-minute miracle weapons to reverse a war already lost. In this balance between brilliance and desperation lies the true meaning of the Komet, a machine that, for all its promise, proved that the future cannot be forced into the present without exacting a heavy price. The final chapter of the Me-163 Komet's history is best understood as a paradox. It was the most daring expression of Germany's quest for technological shortcuts during the Second World War, yet it delivered almost nothing of tangible value to the Luftwaffe's defensive struggle. It consumed resources, cost lives, and demanded immense effort from engineers and pilots, but the balance sheet of its operational service was dismal. Still, it endures as one of the most memorable aircraft of the war, because it so clearly revealed the tension between innovation and practicality, between the promise of revolutionary speed and the reality of strategic irrelevance. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Fuel shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and relentless Allied pressure meant that even conventional fighter operations had become nearly impossible. Jagdgeschwader 400, the sole operational unit equipped with the Komet, remained only a token force. Its bases were overrun by advancing Allied troops, its aircraft either destroyed, abandoned, or captured intact. The dream of the rocket interceptor had ended not in decisive victories, but in silence on wreck-strewn airfields. For the pilots who had survived, the relief of surrender often outweighed any lingering pride in having flown the most radical machine of the war. The Allies, meanwhile, treated the Komet as a technological prize. Engineers dissected its airframe, its fuel systems, and its aerodynamic profile. Some were astonished that such an advanced design had been built at all under the conditions of total war. But the deeper lesson was cautionary. Extreme performance meant nothing without reliability, safety, and strategic coherence. The Me-163 had stretched the envelope of what was possible, but in doing so, it had exposed the perils of leaping too far ahead without considering the operational cost. In the post-war decades, the Komet's image persisted as a symbol of both fascination and futility. Historians, engineers, and aviation enthusiasts debated its significance. Was it a failed weapon or an invaluable research tool? Museums displayed it as a curiosity, a relic of an era when desperation drove innovation to extremes. To generations raised in the jet and space ages, the Komet appeared almost prophetic, its swept wings and rocket power foreshadowing the sleek lines of supersonic aircraft and spacecraft. Yet its actual role in the war remained negligible, overshadowed by the practical success of the jet-powered Me-262 and the overwhelming strength of Allied industry. The Komet's story also serves as a reminder of the human cost of such experimentation. Dozens of pilots and ground crew died not at the hands of the enemy, but in accidents, fires, and crashes caused by the unforgiving nature of rocket propulsion. These losses underscore the danger of pressing unready technology into service for immediate military gain. In many ways, the Me-163 was less a fighter than a flying testbed pushed into combat before its time, sacrificing lives for lessons that would be fully realized only years later in safer, more refined designs. Ultimately, the Me-163 Komet was both a dead end and a beginning. It ended the line of rocket-powered interceptors, proving them too hazardous and impractical for frontline service. But it began a new chapter in human flight, one that explored the outer limits of speed and altitude. Its failures highlighted the need for jet engines as the true future of aviation, while its experiments fed into the knowledge base that would carry mankind to supersonic speeds and beyond the atmosphere. Thus, the legacy of the Me-163 rests not on the handful of bombers it destroyed, but on the way it forced the world to think differently about flight. Too fast to control, too dangerous to sustain, and too limited to matter in war, it nonetheless marked a threshold in aviation history. The Komet remains a symbol of daring innovation constrained by desperation, a machine that promised the future but arrived too soon, leaving behind a story of brilliance, tragedy, and the unrelenting pursuit of speed.